All right, let's get started. Anybody need a minute or two more, or can we get started? All right, we'll do the usual suspects thing and start with Nathan to give us some basic orientation. And maybe Nathan, you can kind of help us get like an initial sense of the landscape. And then when we come back around, you can kind of give us more detailed personal opinion. So yeah, let's start with you and then end with you as well.
Okay. I will do my best with the caveat that I think there's still a lot of unknowns, and this is like not necessarily my big area, but this is just what I'm just going to say what I have picked up in my best understanding of the situation. So basically on Friday night, there was a bad configuration file that was pushed into the update queue for Crowdstrike. It seemed to have been live for maybe an hour or two at most before Crowdstrike caught it and replaced it with a good file. But that was enough time for a lot of machines to pull it down. That file gets read in by what's called a kernel driver. So for CrowdStrike to do its magic, what it's doing is it's kind of like antivirus on steroids. It's just like this. It's detecting things. It's doing it very, very robustly. It's doing a lot of central reporting to do that sort of detection rather than relying on some of the inbuilt Windows APIs. They kind of have their own special sauce and they're hooking into sort of the heart of Windows, the kernel, to add that special sauce in. That driver that they had, when it read that bad configuration file, it crashed. And because it was in the kernel, the heart of the machine, it crashing took down the whole system, and you get a blue screen. It turns out that there was kind of a race condition here because what you had is you have two CrowdStrike processes actually starting up. But one is the scanner itself, and the other one is the updater. It checks to see if there's new configuration files available. And if the updater actually manages to start and download an update before the engine started, you were fine. Your computer started. But most of the time, the engine would start faster because it was kind of a simpler thing, and it's a kernel module and it's loaded, tends to get loaded sooner. And if it started first, it would read the bad file and the system would die before it could pull down an update and you would get the blue screen. The big problem, it seems, with remediation of this is that Windows is going down before it's kind of done any sort of communications with anything. So you can't really like push an update out to systems. If it's a cloud system, you've just kind of got to rebuild it. If it's a actual desktop system, well, if you restart it enough, eventually the updater might win that race. Or you have to go in, boot into safe mode, decrypt your hard drive if it's decrypted, and hope you have the backup encryption key, and then delete this one file, and then it's fine. Microsoft actually released a tool that creates a bootable drive that does exactly that steps. It literally, all it does is do three things. It boots the system up. It asks you for your decryption key for your hard drive, finds the file, deletes it, reboots the system. It's like a shell script. It's all it does, but that fixes it. Unfortunately, you kind of have to do a step like that to fix it. A lot of organizations rely on CrowdStrike. That's been pointed out in the thread. It's a big leader in the space. They do a lot of things, not just this particular sort of endpoint defense, but they also have red team and penetration testing offerings and a lot of different security offerings. They've got their fingers in tons of stuff, and they're a very big player in the market. Um, it, I think that's kind of like the basic, the broad issues. This was sort of exacerbated a little bit, but Microsoft had their own outage on Friday as well, and A lot of people thought that they were related. They don't look like they were, but I think there was sort of a 1-2 punch going on. The CrowdStrike one was definitely the most visible one. That's the one where you had all the people's laptops blue screening and whatnot. And there's still recovery efforts ongoing. It's going to take a while because all these systems basically have to be touched by hand to fix them. So I think that's like the 10,000-foot view of my understanding of what happened at a technical level. It's not a driver; it's a configuration file. It was up for a very short time, so this kind of tells you how fragile a lot of these systems are. Like if it had been up for longer and more systems had pulled down the update, what would we have seen? Um, and then I think the biggest thing was kind of interesting to me was that it's actually been less of the problem of having to touch the systems that has been the barrier to recovery, and more actually the move towards more secure endpoints, in particular endpoint encryption, because it's turned out that a lot of companies have not managed those encryption keys very well. They're in situations now where they need to do this restore, but nobody knows actually the recovery key for the drive. And so there's sort of a proximate distal thing here in terms of the actual cause is this bad update with CrowdStrike, but there's a lot of like ecosystem things going on. As I will hold on all my thoughts with that. I've already dropped a lot into the thread. And I think with that background, are we passing up or passing down? I'll just pass up arbitrarily and go to Grigori.
I will be fast. I just have several points. First, in my view, the zero fail policy is unachievable, so failures will happen. Some of them will be big. But every failure is instructive because it helps to prevent worse outcomes in the future. So now everybody will be busy for several months probably fixing everything they can fix. Another point that the issue is the difference between scales. Like Microsoft is huge, but somebody has to keep it in check. So to keep whatever Microsoft is vulnerable to, you need like orders of magnitude smaller company, in this particular case, CrowdStrike. Then to keep CrowdStrike in check, you need even smaller company. Probably, my guess. The point is that whatever works most of the time for a huge company, it does not necessarily work for a smaller company. So you cannot really rely on the same processes because the point of having smaller companies is to keep a larger company in check. So there should be something done differently. But whether you can afford it or not to do it differently is a completely different issue, which helps us to come to the issue of incentives. We have to ask ourselves how do the efforts in antivirus space or security space get funded. If there are no incidents, people will forget that they need to pay for it. So the funding will dry up. So you kind of need failures, just like reminders that the whole antivirus and failure industry should exist. And probably the last point is it's an example of a very familiar pattern when the fix becomes a threat. You want to fix something, so you give a special privileges or special access for the software that is supposed to do the fix. And then the fact that you gave these privileges or you gave special access to this software can drive the whole system down. But without these special privileges, you cannot really protect the larger system. And it happens quite frequently. It's not only in anti-virus space. And the very last point, I was thinking about it, but I don't have an answer. Imagine for a moment that all the software involved in the failure is written with copilots, meaning that it is written like 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x faster and more efficiently. My problem with that is, in this case, you won't have a lot of people who kind of paid a lot of attention to what's going on just because they spent so much time working on particular engineering problems. And in my view, if you don't have these people and everything is easy and everything is done with a copilot, then the crashes will be more devastating. But I'm not completely sure about that. And on that, I will pass it up. Don't see who is up, but it's Ben.
Ben, if you're speaking, you can.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
now.
good. Sorry. I wanted to talk a bit about, I think it was mentioned this could be a regulatory problem. The basic idea being, these are not all the businesses are the real world businesses that that's hit badly. They are not IT businesses, so they have to have these IT systems that they need. They're either partially or entirely in house, and so they're regulated. They need to have something for cybersecurity. This is a standard for cybersecurity. So you check the box, you press the button, you saying, oh yeah, we're protected by Crowdstrike or whatever, we're fine. And then of course everyone does this, and then something goes wrong with Crowdstrike and everything blows up. But the thing is that this is not just a regulatory problem. This is this actually reminds me of like a financial market crash or panic, where because I was listening to Ben Hunt talk about this sort of thing not too long ago, and he was talking about like the worst case scenario for someone like making a decision is generally not like the decision goes badly. Like the worst case scenario is not like you blow up. The worst case scenario is, I mean, especially if everyone else blows up at the same time. If the whole world blows up, you're fine because you can just say, hey, everyone went down. Everyone, this is a global problem. It was like a hurricane. So, act of God. I'm not to blame. The worst thing that could happen is always, uncorrelated either failures or lack of success. So if everyone else saves money and you don't, you're screwed. If no one else blows up but you do, you're screwed. But if you take the standard and everyone blows up, then it's not your fault and you don't have to do anything. So that I think is I think the core failure here, which is that this involved very high cost, but they're not the kind of costs that in relatively uncompetitive markets, which is what most of these are in, that will cause the failure of any business. So like the costs were all borne by average people that couldn't make their flights or couldn't check out or couldn't access their apps or had a bad day, basically. So that could be billions or even tens of billions, hundreds of billions, probably not hundreds of billions, but tens of billions of costs. But just very diffuse, everyone had to do a bad day. No one's going to go out of business from this because the costs aren't bared by them. There's no one who is fine, who everyone can switch to make sure this never happens again. So there's no way to lose market share over such a widespread crash or issue. So there's sort of no incentive to actually fix this. In fact, there's an incentive to, obviously if this is constant, then maybe eventually, if the business never does anything, is always in these kind of crashes, then eventually something does break permanently and they go out of business. But, so long as these are not that level of catastrophe that the world entirely ends, they're just diffuse causes that can be dumped on sort of the public at large or the social system at large, and therefore never really threaten anything, and therefore are fine. I'm sure, and I know we can say, well, that's not good, and I agree it's not good, but from the as the powers that be, this is fine. So some days you'll have a bad day because half the systems blew up, but as long as that's not every other day, we just bear those costs. Is that a good answer to the solution? No. Do I have a better way to design a system so this sort of thing isn't in common failure mode? I don't really know of one. So, good luck moving it up.
Yeah, I don't know the internal technical details of how this CrowdStrike thing works, but so I was basically surfing through the effects of it, and then actually I was really surprised uh, by the number of industries that uh, Windows is actually used and such a large market share it has. So I was surprised by that, and then basically like and I had not even heard about CrowdStrike before, and but it seems quite a big company, and the way in which this incident happened is like uh, does not uh, does not seem a good work by the company itself, because it makes enough money. They should have tested it on a smaller amount of computers. I don't know how it went through, but yeah, it does seem some sloppy work somewhere. And basically the I was surprised that a lot of hospitals also use this, and then if a system crashes, then somebody might I don't know, might have his health affected in some way, or might, if the surgery is going on, if the systems don't start, uh, that might affect somebody's life. So I don't know. And then I had also seen some people calling for a class action on this. I don't know how far that will go. uh, yeah, so those were my initial thoughts. Passing on to Jenna or Anant, or maybe it's Venkat now.
Yeah, looks like Jenna and Anant are both on mute today. Yeah, so I'll keep it brief. The main thing I want to flag, I think, is a couple of metaphors and mental models that occur to me. One is the idea of autoimmune disease. So it seems like when a system gets to a certain level of complexity, subsystems that are meant to ensure security themselves become vulnerable, and it creates a almost a second order pathology that becomes particularly hard, right? So in human biology and healthcare, AIDS and similar autoimmune diseases are particularly hard to do anything about, because the immune system is supposed to protect you, and if itself screws up and starts attacking you, what do you do? So that to me is almost an existence proof that you can't really avoid it. It's a function of a certain level of complexity, because it's not clear to me how you can design defense systems that don't themselves open up secondary attack surfaces. No, I shouldn't call them attack surfaces, but fragility surfaces for autoimmune disease. They can also become attack surfaces, because as Nathan posted that link, in this case, because of this CrowdStrike shutdown, now hackers are getting, like, the original thing wasn't a hack, but now the system is vulnerable and hackers are starting to exploit this, right? And this is how most people who die of AIDS, right? Their immune system is compromised, and then they get something like a cold, and then they die of the cold. So the immune systems is autoimmune diseases is one mental model I think is useful here. Another mental model I think is that of reinsurance markets. So everywhere there's like unmodeled risk that you manage with like general types of insurance. And then there's like a big black swan event of like correlated risks that causes a huge number of like similar systems to fail at the same time. The insurance companies themselves fail. And then there is this kind of market called reinsurance market, which is insurance companies for insurance companies. And then they kick in, and they rarely have to pay out at all because they handle such extreme tail risks. But for example, 9/11 was a large scale event that I think caused a lot of reinsurance companies to, I don't know if they went under, but they were like deeply stressed. Climate is another example where there's a big correlated, unmodeled, and widespread risk that sort of like falls back to the reinsurance market, and it's going to like screw up. And in a related sort of like mental model, look at the housing insurance market in California. As the risk of wildfires kept going up and houses became more and more vulnerable to wildfires, initially insurance rates just went up, then more and more areas became uninsurable, and eventually entire insurance companies exited the market. And there are now areas in the world where insurance cannot operate, and you have like what I think of as fake insurance, where it's like government underwritten backstop insurance schemes, but that's, you can't really call that insurance. That's kind of like open-ended, taxpayer-funded, we do what we can, sort of like public support, right? So this is kind of, I think, the sequence of fallback. Initially, the defense system is supposed to protect against the disease. Then it creates like autoimmune risk. Then when the autoimmune risk cannot be managed, it sort of like causes second order failover to things like reinsurance schemes and so forth, and also risk to normal diseases that normally would not kill you. And eventually, when all else fails, it becomes completely diffused social risk that's just handled by taxpayers. So I think there's like 4 or 5 levels of failover here. So the third thing I wanted to quickly mention, what was it? Yeah, the idea that openness and open source will somehow solve this, I'm kind of extremely skeptical, because I mean, biology is sort of like meaningfully open systems in many ways. Biological systems just eat whatever food is available out there. So they have like an open thermodynamic boundary, but they're not immune to such things. But more specifically in computer systems, I don't think this is an openness or open source type of thing. I think it's just that the architecture of these big complex systems will necessarily create bottlenecks that are hard to provision, which means whether it's sort of like proprietary market where one vendor gets a monopoly because they've done some regulatory capture and it's hard for competition to boot up. That's what happened here. That's what happens with like Intuit that provides taxpayer software. So that's one way. But even in open source, I mean, we've all seen the meme of like the random person in Nebraska who's the sole maintainer of one package. And that's like an open system that supposedly promotes diversity and such, but it's equally vulnerable. So I don't know if it's as vulnerable, but I'm sure if you look around, you'll find that Linux and other systems also have equally bad single points of failure. And I don't think you can like localize and decentralize your way out of it, because anytime you have like complex coordination, you can't decouple everything. Like I keep going back to the example of like, crypto is supposed to be maximally decentralized and everything is supposedly open source. But now you have L2s with centralized sequencers. And I use that as my go-to example of the bottleneck just moves. Like you can open up and decentralize the architecture as much as you want, but so long as you're trying to do complex things, so long as you're not limiting yourself to like, oh, I'm just not going to do complex global coordination, I'll have a local economy. If you're doing that kind of like almost degrowth philosophy, maybe it'll work. But if you're trying to do complex things and solve complex global challenges, you will have complex global systems which will have bottlenecks, whether or not it's open or closed. Anyway, so those were my 3 points up to Sachin, I think.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I agree with a lot of things mentioned. Yeah, it does feel like, yeah, I was looking into sort of like the regulation around um, installing this type of installing Crowdstrike, and I guess it's um, something like most government offices or airlines are required to have some sort of like antivirus thing. And I think there's like insurance, like there's like insurance providers that look for specific antivirus tools, and probably I'm assuming and I have to look more into this, but I'm assuming the CrowdStrike business model is to get in on the list of the insurance providers as like a whitelisted, approved solution or whatever. Um, and and I feel like there are a lot of businesses that are sort of, maybe they don't focus much on the actual product. The focus is more on finding these, like basically becoming an expert in like regulation and um, and yeah, and that seems. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of those type of uh, companies that exist, and I don't know if CrowdStrike is one of them, but it feels like based on the amount of market it has, possibly um, possibly could be. Um, uh, and I'm sure, like, yeah, it's hard to understand how much of regulation or regulatory protocols are like good faith, or and how much of it is sort of like for captured by the company or probably written by the company itself. Uh, so um, so there's that, and that's a line that I'm interested in thinking about more. And my girlfriend's dad is a pilot, and he was telling me that there's been a move in airlines to completely move towards only using digital things and not using paper and pen at all, in any way at all. So it's like a thing that is trained in their flight simulators or whatever. And um, I don't know, that seems kind of worrying in some way. Um, and um, and yeah, so I feel like in the coming years there will be a more push towards. There is like a lot of industries that still use paper and pen or like some other form of documentation, and there will be a push towards all of them being only digital, only, which would mean assuming the risk would increase with that. And yeah, and also wonder how much of this is like an aftershock, basically, like the supply chain and airline issues that started in 2020, which means all these systems are really stretched, and nobody really has like nobody's really paying much attention to CrowdStrike or whatever software that they use, because they have a lot of other issues to deal with, especially in like flight, airline, ports, etc. Um, so, um, so yeah, I'm assuming that that's why maybe part of the reason why those industries were the most affected by this. And yeah, I guess one of the challenges of like open source solving this is that it may solve the technology problem, but then how do you solve like for regulatory protocols and becoming sort of like a master of like regulation and building products around that? I don't know if there are examples of open source products that have done that. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
So as Venkat, you wanted me to come in at the end with some of my thoughts, so I guess I'll cap this out. I think I agree a lot of with where Ben and Venkat were going in terms of this being sort of this diffuse social risk. I will say, sort of in my previous job, I interacted a lot with our legal team. In the legal team, one of the legal team's responsibility was figuring out insurance. Oddly enough, in that organization, and it was somewhat sobering to watch the insurance market, particularly for cyber insurance, kind of drying up for sort of kind of small, medium size businesses. And I wonder if it will eventually kind of dry up for large businesses as well. I think we may be moving into a regime where cybersecurity is kind of like another uninsurable thing. Um, it doesn't have to necessarily be this way, but there are significant trade-offs, I think, that sort of lead it to be this way. And one of the problems is that it takes, you can write things that are more memory safe. You can write things that fail more gracefully, but all of that takes time. And all of that takes resources. And so you wind up with things that might be more robust in sort of a this kind of mathematical sense. You know, they are stable against perturbations. Once part of the system goes down, the system itself can kind of keep chugging along. But those things become more expensive. And they're expensive either because they literally cost more, or they're expensive because you pay the same amount of money, but they are less capable. So you're sort of paying more per unit of capability, or they're expensive in the sense that they're slower, which I think is something that we tend to really underrate. There's a real emphasis on speed in everything we do. Nobody likes slow things. There's also a penalty with rate of change, and I think that's the biggest penalty, and it's something that I encountered a lot when I was actually working with essentially email marketing. Is like you could take the stance and say, I'm going to do the right thing by my base, by my customers, and I'm going to be a little bit slower and a little bit more careful, but give them a more stable thing. But the problem is that the people you are talking to, or the people you're selling to, generally aren't prioritizing the security thing, because it's this hard to model thing. It's all of these incidents are actually, they're sort of low probability, high impact events. Even like all the scams in our personal lives are kind of low probability, high impact events, and people are terrible at modeling those, both personally and I think at like an institutional level. And so nobody really takes that into account. And so you have a competitor who comes along and does things a little bit more fast and loose, and they can move faster than you, and they eat your lunch. And I don't know how you necessarily solve that. I think there are some things you can do with mandated openness, and I think it's less about. I used to be a big open source advocate, like open code. I've come to the conclusion that it's actually less about the code being open and more about openness of um, protocols in many sense, not just in terms of APIs, but also data formats. But the idea that it's an interoperability and enforced interoperability, and that can give you more modular systems that can be maybe a little bit easier to switch out and give you a little bit more diversity. I think good examples of that actually in the open source world. There's the joke about it's not Linux, it's GNU Linux, but I think there's an important point there is that a lot of Linux is very, very modular, and you can kind of pop things out and Frankenstein your systems, and it's very, very that ecosystem is very, very amenable to that. And no, that doesn't solve some of these issues, but it does give you the potential to have more diversity. The problem is when it begins interacting with the regulatory framework, and then you wind up back in this same place because as Sachin was pointing out, Crowdstrike's sort of on the short list of these things. Or you're going to virtualize things. So Amazon runs on Linux. AWS runs on Linux, but it's hardly an open environment. And if everybody was running cloud desktops and there was a big Amazon outage, then the results would be very, very similar to this. So there's a computer level, but there's also, I think this is more caused by sort of the interaction between the computational level and the social regulatory level. And I'm not sure you can do some mandated openness. I think maybe a lot of it is like how things are prioritized, and it's not clear how you change that prioritization. And also, any way that you would change it would really gore a lot of oxes. Like it would, there would be very big players who are very invested in, like, Microsoft being like, well, we have to keep Windows this way because of EU, like EU regulatory. Well, that's like 50% just true because the EU regulatory regime is kind of bad when it comes to this sort of thing. But it's also 50% self-serving. The EU regulatory regime is bad, but there's ways you can work around and work with it. But it actually sort of in Microsoft's interest to kind of push this risk off. And everybody, it's like the Spider-Man, the three Spider-Mans, each one pointing at each other. You wind up in this situation, and everybody can pass the buck. And so you wind up with these sorts of diffuse social risks, like Ben was talking about. I could go on, and I have tons of thoughts I've dropped already in the thread, but we are almost at time, so I will just leave it at that. Is that I think there are some things that can be done at a technical level. I think they do push you towards more modularity and openness, but I think the social pressures around both accountability and around actually, I'm just going to say around accountability really push back the other way towards a degree of centralization. And that's kind of hard to, how do you square wanting something that's diffuse and robust with the single ringable mech principle? There's real trade-offs there. And also, how do you square that with the fact that we do need to move fast sometimes? If we had a society that moved slow, maybe we could be more robust, but how do you deal with the asteroid or the sudden climate change or the pandemic that we have so far been dealing with 2 out of 3 of those, and I'm hoping the third doesn't actually happen. All right, that's my thoughts. I will leave it there.
All right, and since we're at time, anybody else have any last burning thoughts to share? If not, I think this is actually a good discussion with which to identify a bunch of future threads that are worth pulling on. So if you can kind of like think of named threads that come out of this that we can develop more readings on, please share. Like one that came to me is single points of failure. Like we use the phrase a lot, but we don't actually think hard about what it means and what are the sort of like laws of single points of failure. So I'm going to look for readings for that. So things like that. If you have a couple of ideas of like good topics, please post them in the main channel. All right. See you guys next week.